Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow, as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften, like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. They finished the last delivery right as the sky started to fade from gray into that early morning blue. Not quite sunrise, just the moment when the night finally loosened its grip. The van was quieter now. No more route alerts, no more quick stops. Only the soft sound of tires rolling over empty streets. They didn't go home right away. Instead, they turned toward a small park a few blocks off the main road, the kind of park that stayed almost empty on weekdays. A few benches, a looping path, tall trees that had been there long before any of the surrounding buildings. They parked, stepped out, and pulled their jacket tighter. The air smelled like damp earth and leaves, fresh in a way that made the lungs feel more awake. They walked slowly down the path, boots pressing into the ground with a gentle crunch. Leaves had fallen overnight, and each step made a quiet sound like paper being folded. They liked this hour. It wasn't busy yet. No joggers, no kids, no dogs barking, just space. They had been feeling something lately that they didn't know how to name at first. A kind of dull pressure, not panic, not sadness. More like the sense that their life was small. Not in a bad way, just unnoticed. They drove around all day, dropping off packages, following directions, meeting deadlines. People opened doors, signed screens, took boxes, then moved on. Sometimes they were thanked. Sometimes they weren't. Either way, it all disappeared quickly. They had caught themselves thinking more than once. Is this it? Am I doing anything that matters? It wasn't that they wanted fame. They just wanted to feel like they had weight in the world, like their existence left something behind. They reached a stretch of path where the trees grew thicker. The light shifted under the branches, softer and darker, like stepping into another kind of room. There was one tree in particular, massive, old, with a trunk so wide it looked like it had been built rather than grown. Its bark was rough and deeply lined. Its branches spread out calmly, like it had all the time in the world. They stopped in front of it and tilted their head back. The tree didn't look impressive in a loud way. It wasn't blooming. It wasn't colorful. It was simply there. And somehow, standing near it, they felt their chest loosen a little. They remembered something they had read once, a simple fact that had felt abstract at the time. Trees make oxygen. Quietly. Constantly. Without asking to be noticed, they stood there looking up through the branches and let that sink in. The tree didn't need to do anything dramatic to be valuable. It wasn't proving itself. It was supporting life just by existing. They looked around at the other trees, the ones that lined the path, and filled the park like a slow, steady crowd. No one was applauding them. No one was taking photos. And yet the air in their lungs was clean because these trees were here. They took a deeper breath. It felt strange to realize how much they depended on something they rarely thought about. They thought about their own life again. The small things that didn't get counted. The steady reliability. The way they showed up for work even when they didn't feel like it. The way they made sure packages arrived. Medicine got delivered, little everyday needs got met. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. They started walking again, slower now. Not because they were tired, but because they didn't feel the need to rush away from this feeling. Under the trees, the world felt less demanding. They didn't feel bigger. They felt more placed, like they belonged somewhere even without being seen. They sat down on a bench not far from the old tree, letting their body rest without checking the time. The sky had grown lighter now, a soft wash of pale color behind the branches. A bird moved somewhere above them. Leaves shifted gently as a breeze passed through. Nothing felt urgent. They thought about how rarely they allowed themselves to simply exist without measuring the moment, without asking whether it was productive or meaningful enough to justify taking up space. The forest didn't seem to worry about that. The trees weren't competing with one another. They weren't trying to stand out. Each one took what it needed, light, water, space, and gave back oxygen, shade, and quiet stability in return. That felt important. They realized that value didn't always announce itself. Some forms of worth worked slowly, invisibly, sustaining things in ways that were only noticed when they were gone. They thought about how many people depended on what they did without ever knowing their name. The deliveries that kept daily life running. The consistency that others relied on without thinking twice. They had dismissed those things as ordinary. But the forest was ordinary too. And still, it kept the world alive. They closed their eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, feeling the air fill their chest. It felt fuller, somehow richer, as if their body recognized what their mind was only beginning to accept. They didn't need to be exceptional to matter. They didn't need to leave a dramatic mark. Being steady, being present, being part of the system that allowed life to keep moving. That was enough. When they stood up, their steps felt more grounded, less rushed. The old tree remained behind them, unchanged, unbothered. As they walked back toward the van, the city was starting to wake up. A few lights flicked on. A distant engine started. They knew the day would be busy again. Packages, routes, the familiar rhythm of work. But they carried something different with them now. A quiet understanding that even if no one noticed, even if nothing about their life looked impressive from the outside, they were still contributing simply by being here. Like the forest, silent, steady, essential. He stepped out onto the small rooftop during his lunch break, the door closing softly behind him. The city was bright at this hour, washed in sunlight that flattened shadows and made everything feel exposed. He squinted slightly and leaned against the railing. Down below, traffic moved in steady lines. Horns sounded now and then, impatient but distant. The air smelled faintly of hot concrete and coffee from somewhere nearby. He liked coming up here when he needed a pause. Not because it was peaceful, it wasn't. But because no one expected anything from him for a few minutes. He checked his phone out of habit, then slipped it back into his pocket without opening anything. The screen felt louder than the world around him. Lately, he had been carrying a strange feeling through his days. A sense of being invisible even while surrounded by people. In meetings, he spoke when it was his turn. He did his work. He met deadlines. Still, it felt like something about him wasn't registering. Others seemed to move forward more easily. They were noticed, remembered. He told himself he shouldn't care about that. That wanting to be seen was shallow. But the feeling didn't go away just because he judged it. He tilted his head back and looked up at the sky. It was a solid, blinding blue. No clouds, no softness. Somewhere up there, he knew stars were still burning. Even now. Even at noon. He remembered learning that as a kid and being strangely unsettled by it. The idea that something so bright could exist and yet be completely hidden by light. Standing there now, it made sense in a different way. He thought about how often he mistook visibility for existence. How easily he assumed that if something wasn't noticed, it wasn't there. But the stars didn't stop shining just because no one could see them. They didn't dim themselves during the day. They didn't disappear. They waited. He felt his shoulders drop a little as that thought settled in. Maybe the parts of him that felt unseen weren't gone. Maybe they were simply not in the kind of light that revealed them. The wind brushed against his face, warm and dry. He closed his eyes for a moment and focused on his breathing. In, out. He didn't need to perform here. He didn't need to explain himself. The rooftop wasn't impressed by anyone. He opened his eyes again and looked back at the sky. The stars were still there, unbothered, unrushed. He stood there until his break was almost over, letting the idea sit quietly in the background of his thoughts. When he turned to go back inside, he felt less anxious than before. Not because anything had changed, but because he no longer felt erased by the brightness of the day. He went back to his desk and settled into the afternoon without the usual tightness in his chest. Emails came in, tasks lined up. The familiar rhythm returned, but something in him stayed softer. As the hours passed, he noticed how often he had been checking for signs of acknowledgement without realizing it. A nod, a comment, a reaction that said, "Yes, you matter here." That need didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. He remembered the stars again, how they didn't rush to be seen, how their existence didn't depend on the sky being dark enough to show them. They burned steadily regardless. Later, as he left the building and stepped into the bright street, the sunlight felt less harsh than it had earlier. Not because it had changed, but because he wasn't taking it personally anymore. He walked a few blocks before heading toward the train, letting the city move around him. People passed by busy with their own thoughts, their own timelines. No one was looking at him. And for once, that didn't sting. He realized that he had been asking the wrong question. Not, am I being seen right now? But am I still here even when I'm not? The answer was quiet but clear. Yes. His worth didn't turn on and off with attention. It didn't fade under brighter lights. There were parts of him that lived in deeper layers, skills, values, kindnesses that didn't always show up on the surface. They were still active, still real. That evening, as the sky finally darkened and the first stars began to appear, he paused on the platform and looked up. There they were. Nothing about them had changed since noon, only the conditions. He felt a gentle reassurance settle in his body. He didn't need to force himself into visibility. He didn't need to compete with the daylight. Some things shine in their own time, and some truths are steady enough to wait. She didn't mean to drop the bowl. It slipped from her hands while she was drying it, the towel catching on the edge just enough to twist it out of her grip. It hit the floor with a sharp sound louder than she expected. Then silence. She stood still for a second, heart beating faster than it needed to. The bowl lay in pieces at her feet, clean breaks running through the ceramic like thin lines drawn on purpose. She exhaled slowly and crouched down. Some of the pieces were large, some were small, almost dust-like at the edges. Nothing was completely shattered, but there was no pretending it was fine. She gathered the pieces carefully, placing them on the table one by one. The room was quiet except for the soft scrape of ceramic against wood. She had always hated breaking things, not because of the mess, but because of what it made her feel careless, clumsy, like she should have known better. That feeling was familiar. It showed up in other places too, when she said the wrong thing, when she trusted too quickly, when something in her life cracked instead of holding together. She sat down and looked at the pieces spread out in front of her. The bowl had been one of her favorites. Not expensive, just comfortable. The kind of object that fit easily into her hands, like it had learned their shape over time. She remembered hearing once about Kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Not hiding the cracks, not smoothing them away, highlighting them. At the time, she had thought it sounded poetic, but impractical. Something nice to look at in a book, not something you actually did. Now, with the broken bowl in front of her, the idea returned differently. She picked up one piece and traced the edge of the break with her finger. It was sharp, but precise. Clean. The break wasn't random. It followed a line that had always been there, hidden in the structure, waiting for the right moment to show itself. That thought stayed with her. How many of her own cracks had formed the same way? Not suddenly, but quietly over time under pressure. She thought about the moments she usually tried to hide, the ones she replayed late at night and wished she could edit out of her story. She had learned to move past them quickly, to patch things up in a way that made them less visible, to act like nothing had happened. But the bowl on the table refused that option. It couldn't go back to being what it was. She could throw it away. That would be easier. She could replace it with something new, something unbroken, something that didn't carry a history. She sat with those options for a while. Then she imagined the gold-filled cracks of Kintsugi, the way the lines didn't apologize for themselves, the way the object became something else still useful, but also marked. She didn't reach for glue yet. Instead, she stayed there breathing, letting the discomfort settle without trying to rush past it. The bowl was broken, and for once, she didn't feel the urge to hide that fact. She cleaned the table and laid the pieces out again, slower this time, as if the pace itself mattered. There was no rush to fix anything yet. She studied the breaks, carefully noticing how they fit together, how each line had a logic of its own. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. As she worked, she thought about how quickly she usually tried to move on from things that hurt. How often she rushed to become functional again before she had actually understood what had broken. This felt different. Here, repair required attention, patience, a willingness to look closely at the damage without turning away. She imagined the gold tracing each crack, not covering it, but following it exactly as it was, turning the fracture into something intentional. It made her think of her own scars, the moments she had learned to call mistakes, the times she wished she had been stronger, quieter, less affected. What if those moments weren't meant to disappear? What if they were meant to be acknowledged, outlined gently, held with care? She realized that healing didn't always mean returning to the original shape. Sometimes it meant allowing a new one to form. The bowl, once repaired, would never look the same, but it would carry its history openly, without apology. She liked that idea, not because it made pain beautiful, but because it made honesty possible. When she finally stood up, the pieces remained on the table, still separate. The work wasn't finished, and that was fine. Some things didn't need to be rushed into wholeness. As the room grew quieter, she felt a familiar softness settle in her chest. Not sadness, not relief, acceptance. She turned off the light and left the bowl where it was broken but seen. And for the first time, she understood that her own healing might look the same, unfinished, visible, and still worthy of care. They sat on the edge of the couch, with a notebook resting on their knees, the room lit only by a small lamp near the wall. Outside, the evening had settled in quietly, without any announcement. It had been one of those days. Nothing terrible had happened, nothing especially good either. But their mind felt crowded, like too many thoughts had been left open at the same time. They opened the notebook and stared at the blank page. Usually, when emotions showed up like this, they tried to push them away. Stay busy, scroll longer, distract harder. Tonight, none of that worked, so they stayed where they were. A thought rose first, sharp and impatient. I should be doing more. Then another followed close behind. I'm falling behind. Then a quieter one, harder to catch. Something is wrong with me. They recognized the pattern. Once one thought appeared, the others rushed in, each one pulling the next along with it like a small herd that refused to move in a straight line. They picked up the pen and wrote the first word that came to mind. Tired. They paused, surprised by how true it felt. Another feeling nudged forward, anxious. Then one more, lonely. The page began to fill slowly, not with explanations, but with names. They had learned something during their training about emotions, about the nervous system, about how feelings worked. But knowing didn't always make it easier to live with them. Tonight, though, a different image came to mind. A shepherd, not shouting, not chasing, just standing steady, watching the flock move, guiding it gently when it drifted too far. They looked at the list again. These weren't enemies. They were signals. Each emotion wanted something. Rest, reassurance, connection. None of them needed to be eliminated. They took a slow breath and placed a hand on their chest. For once, they didn't try to fix how they felt. They simply noticed it. The emotions shifted slightly, not disappearing but loosening their grip as if relieved to be seen. They wrote another word. Present. That one surprised them too. They leaned back against the couch, the notebook still open, and let their breathing find its own rhythm. Maybe leadership didn't mean control. Maybe it meant staying close enough not to abandon what was already here. The room felt calmer, even though the thoughts hadn't stopped completely. They were still there, but they weren't running the show. They closed the notebook and set it on the table, not because everything had been sorted out, but because that was enough for tonight. The lamp cast a soft circle of light across the room, leaving the rest in shadow. They noticed how different their body felt now. The tightness in their shoulders had eased. Their jaw wasn't clenched anymore. The emotions were still present, moving quietly in the background, but they no longer felt overwhelming. They had space to move without colliding. They thought again about the image of the shepherd. A shepherd didn't demand silence from the flock, didn't expect perfect order. The job wasn't to stop movement. It was to keep the group together and moving in the same general direction. They realized that leadership, when it came to their inner world, looked like this: staying awake, staying kind, setting gentle boundaries. When worry tried to run ahead, they noticed it and slowed their pace. When sadness lagged behind, they didn't leave it there. Nothing was pushed out. Nothing was shamed. They had spent years believing that emotional strength meant being unaffected, that calm meant the absence of feeling. Now they saw it differently. Calm was the ability to stay present while feelings moved through. They turned off the lamp and let the room grow darker. As they lay down, their thoughts drifted again, but without urgency. They didn't chase them. They didn't wrestle them. They trusted themselves to guide the night gently. Outside, the world continued as it always did. Inside, they rested in the quiet understanding that they were no longer being dragged by their emotions. They were walking with them. And that made all the difference. He noticed the plant the way you notice something you've been ignoring. Not because it suddenly appeared, but because you finally looked. It sat near the window in a simple clay pot, leaves slightly drooped soil looking dry and tired. Nothing dramatic, no dead stems, no falling leaves all over the floor. Just a quiet sign of neglect. He stood there with his keys still in his hand, coat half on mind, already moving toward tomorrow. He had a habit of taking care of what was urgent first. What was loud, what demanded attention, emails, deadlines, messages he felt he should answer right away. But the plant didn't ask. It waited. He set his keys down, walked into the kitchen, and filled a small glass with water. The tap ran for a second, then steadied into a clean stream. He carried the water back and poured slowly. The soil darkened almost immediately, soaking it in as if it had been holding its breath. A faint, earthy smell rose up, soft and familiar. He watched the water disappear into the dirt and felt something in him settle. It was such a small action. Almost nothing. And yet it did something his mind had been struggling to do all day, bring him back to himself. He had been feeling stretched lately, not in a dramatic way. More like he was constantly one step behind his own life, always reacting, always managing. He took care of everyone else's needs first. At work, he solved problems. At home, he kept things running. Even when he rested with one eye open. And somewhere in that pace, his inner world had started to look like this plant. Still alive, still there, but quietly drying out. He touched one leaf gently with his fingertip. It wasn't crisp. It wasn't ruined. It just needed attention. He thought about how often he waited for a big moment to start healing. A vacation. A fresh week. A perfect morning. As if care only counted when it came in large doses. But gardening didn't work that way. Plants didn't need a grand gesture. They needed steady water, light, small acts done consistently. He looked around his apartment. It was clean enough, functional. But he realized how little he had asked himself lately, how am I doing? Not as a performance question, not as a checklist, as a real check-in. He sat down by the window with the plant in front of him, hands resting on his knees. Outside, traffic moved and the world kept going. Inside, he stayed still for a moment. He didn't feel suddenly peaceful. He just felt present, and that he realized was the first kind of watering. He stayed by the window longer than he planned to, watching how the light shifted across the floor as the afternoon moved on. The plant looked the same, maybe a little heavier, like it was settling back into itself. He knew it wouldn't change right away. That wasn't how plants worked. They responded slowly, quietly, in ways you only noticed if you paid attention over time. That felt familiar. He thought about how often he treated himself differently, expecting immediate improvement, quick relief, clear results. When those didn't show up, he assumed he was doing something wrong. But gardens weren't fixed in a day, they were tended. He reached into the soil gently and felt around the surface. There were small weeds there, nothing dramatic, just thin stems that had grown unnoticed among the roots. He pinched one and pulled it free. It came out easily. He smiled to himself at how simple that felt. Not everything that crowded a garden belonged there. Not every thought that took up space deserved to stay. He thought about the beliefs he had been carrying for years without questioning them. That rest had to be earned. That caring for himself was selfish. That he could tend to his own needs later once everything else was handled. Those were weeds. They had grown quietly, fed by repetition and habit, not truth. He didn't blame himself for them. He simply noticed them. And noticing, he realized, was already an act of care. He placed the plant back where it belonged and stood up, feeling lighter than before. Not healed, not finished, just slightly more aligned. That evening, he cooked a simple meal instead of skipping dinner. He turned off his phone earlier than usual. He went to bed without replaying the day in his head. None of it felt dramatic, but it felt right. As he lay there in the dark, he understood something gently. Taking care of himself wasn't a side project. It was the main work. Not because it made him better than anyone else, but because it allowed him to live as himself without constantly running on empty. The plant by the window would need water again soon, and so would he. He closed his eyes, knowing that tending to his inner garden wasn't something to finish. It was something to return to again and again. The bathroom light is softer than the lights she has been under all day. Not bright, not demanding, just enough to let her see herself without asking her to perform. She turns on the faucet and lets the water run for a second longer than needed, listening to the steady sound as if it were something familiar she forgot she missed. When she leans forward and splashes her face, the water is cool, almost sharp, and it pulls her attention out of the long day that is still clinging to her shoulders. She looks up at the mirror without really looking yet. All day she has worn the same expression, the polite smile that shows calm and competence, the careful eyes that say, "I'm listening. I've got this." The steady voice that doesn't rush and doesn't shake. It's a face she learned over time, not all at once, piece by piece. At first it was just part of the job. Then it became part of how people recognized her. Then slowly it started to feel like who she was supposed to be. In the mirror, she reaches for the towel and presses it gently against her skin. Not scrubbing, not rushing, just holding it there as if her face needs a moment to catch up with her body. The towel smells faintly like clean cotton and something floral she chose months ago without thinking too much about it. When she lowers the towel, her face looks different. Not dramatic, just quieter. There are faint lines near her eyes that weren't there when she was younger, and a tired softness around her mouth that no amount of sleep seems to fully erase. But there is also something else. Something harder to name, something that feels closer to the beginning of things. She tilts her head slightly, studying her reflection, the way you might study a place you once lived in, trying to remember how it felt before life filled it with furniture. She thinks about all the labels she carries without noticing most days. Reliable, responsible, good with people, strong under pressure. None of them are wrong. But none of them are the whole story either. Somewhere along the way, she started wearing those words the way you wear a uniform. At first it helped. It gave her shape and purpose. It told others how to treat her and told her how to move through the world. But uniforms are heavy when you forget you can take them off. She reaches up and tucks a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small automatic gesture she's done 1,000 times. The mirror reflects the movement back to her, slow and ordinary. And for a moment she imagines herself years ago, before schedules and certifications and expectations stacked up so neatly around her life. She tries to remember her face from then. Not the face in photos. Not the face other people remember. The face she had when no one was watching her closely. When no one needed anything from her. When she wasn't being evaluated, thanked, or depended on. The memory doesn't come clearly. It arrives in pieces. A laugh that was louder and less controlled. Eyes that wandered instead of focusing. A softness that didn't need to be justified. She notices how strange it feels to even ask the question, who was I before the world decided who I should be? The mirror doesn't answer, but it doesn't push back either. She turns off the faucet, and the sudden quiet feels bigger than expected. Without the sound of running water, the room feels still, almost like it's waiting. The hum of the house at night settles in, distant and low, and she becomes aware of her breathing again. Inhale, exhale. She doesn't try to change it. For years she thought healing meant adding things. More confidence, more skills, more proof that she was enough. But standing here bare-faced and tired, she feels a different truth brushing up against her awareness. Maybe it isn't about adding at all. Maybe it's about noticing what was placed on her gently at first, then layered again and again until she forgot where her own edges were. Expectations can be quiet like that. They don't shout. They settle. She leans her palms against the counter and lets her shoulders drop just a little, not collapsing, just loosening. The mirror shows the change immediately, as if her body has been waiting for permission to stop holding itself up so carefully. For a brief moment, she doesn't try to look capable or composed or kind. She just looks. And in that simple act, something soft begins to stir. Not a solution, not an answer, but a sense that beneath all the names she has been called, all the roles she has played well, there is still a face that belongs only to her. A face that was never meant to be earned. She stays there longer than she planned to, not because she is searching for something dramatic, but because for once, nothing is asking her to hurry. The mirror doesn't demand answers. The room doesn't expect performance. Even her own thoughts feel less insistent, as if they've agreed to sit quietly in the background. She straightens up slowly and reaches for the small container on the counter, the one she opens and closes every night without thinking. Tonight she pauses before using it. Her hands rest on the lid, fingers relaxed, not gripping. It occurs to her how often she moves through life on autopilot, guided by invisible checklists that live somewhere between her mind and her muscles. Do this, be that. Don't forget, don't slip. These habits didn't come from nowhere. They grew from praise, from responsibility, from wanting to be useful and needed. None of that was wrong. But over time, the habits stopped feeling like choices and started feeling like rules. She looks at her reflection again this time, not as a problem to solve, but as a presence to keep company with. Her eyes don't look heroic or broken. They look human. And something about that feels grounding. She thinks about how often people talk about finding your worth as if it were something hidden under layers of effort, waiting to be discovered by doing more, proving more, enduring more. But standing here, she feels something simpler and quieter settling in. Worth was never missing. It was just buried under things that were never truly hers. Expectations that fit at first and then slowly grew tight. Roles that were useful but not complete. Stories she learned to repeat because they made sense to other people. She exhales slowly and feels the air move through her chest, not forced, not practiced, just real. The mirror shows the rise and fall of her breath, small and steady, and she realizes she hasn't been this aware of herself all day. Maybe healing doesn't start with becoming someone new. Maybe it starts with allowing yourself to stop being who you were told you had to be. She finally opens the container and applies what she needs. Her movements unhurried, almost ceremonial, though she doesn't think of it that way. It's just care offered without negotiation. No reward at the end, no one keeping score. She remembers how as a child she used to make faces at mirrors. Silly ones, curious ones. Faces that changed every few seconds because there was no reason to hold on to any of them for too long. Somewhere along the way, that freedom disappeared, not stolen, just set aside. The thought doesn't bring sadness the way it once might have. It feels more like recognition, like finding an old photograph and realizing the person in it never really left. They just learned how to be quiet. She steps back from the counter and turns off the light, leaving only the dim glow from the hallway. In the softer shadow, her reflection fades slightly less sharp, less defined. And strangely, that feels right. She doesn't need to see herself clearly all the time. She doesn't need to name herself correctly. She doesn't need to hold her shape so tightly. As she leaves the bathroom, she catches her reflection one last time in the darkened mirror. It's incomplete, blurred at the edges, but there is a calm there that wasn't present before. Not confidence, not certainty, just ease. She walks down the hallway and into the quiet of her home, carrying nothing extra with her. No new goals, no promises to do better tomorrow. Just the subtle relief of having put something down. Maybe the self she's been searching for isn't waiting at the end of a long journey. Maybe it's been here all along, beneath the labels, beneath the effort, patient and untouched, ready to be met again the moment she stops trying to earn her place in her own life. And for tonight, that is enough. Up here, the city sounds different. Not gone, just softened, as if someone turned the volume knob down and left only what was necessary. The wind moves steadily across the rooftop, brushing past the edges of the building and slipping through the small gaps near the door, carrying with it a faint hum that feels older than traffic, older than schedules. He steps closer to the railing and rests his forearms on the cool metal, letting his weight lean forward just enough to feel supported, not strained. Below him, the city stretches outward in scattered lights, windows glowing softly, streets drawing thin lines of movement that look calmer from this distance. From up here, everything feels slower. He checks his radio out of habit, even though nothing has come through for a while. Just static and the occasional clipped voice from somewhere else in the building, reminding him that he's still on duty, still responsible. He lowers the volume again and lets the quiet return. People think being alone like this must feel heavy. And sometimes it does. There are nights when the silence presses in, when the height makes him feel smaller instead of free. When the distance between him and everyone else feels wider than the streets below. But tonight, the quiet doesn't demand anything from him. It just exists. He shifts his stance, boots planted firmly, and looks up. The clouds sit low in the sky, drifting slowly, pale and thick, brushing against the tops of taller buildings, as if they belong there. For a moment, it feels like he's standing right at their edge, not above the city, but alongside the sky itself. He didn't plan to end up here watching over empty hallways and locked doors at night. It started as something temporary. A job to pay bills, a role that didn't follow him home in the same way others might. Over time, it became familiar, predictable, quiet enough to think. And thinking, he has learned, can be both a gift and a burden. During the day, the world is full of noise and motion. People bump into each other, talk over one another, measure themselves against what they see. At night, up on the roof, there's no one to impress, no one to explain himself to. Still, the feeling of being separate lingers. He's spent enough time alone to recognize the difference between loneliness and solitude, even though the line between them can blur without warning. Loneliness feels sharp, like something missing. Solitude feels wide, like something opening. Tonight leans toward wide. He watches the clouds drift and thinks about all the ways people climb in their lives, always looking toward some imagined peak where things will finally make sense. Better job, better version of themselves. A place where doubt no longer reaches. He's been there too, chasing that idea, believing that worth was something earned by reaching higher, standing out, proving endurance. But standing here now, he realizes something quieter. Reaching the top doesn't always look like standing above others. Sometimes it looks like standing alone without falling apart. The wind picks up slightly, tugging at his jacket, and he pulls it closer. Not because he's cold, but because the movement reminds him that he's still here, still in his body, still breathing in this moment that doesn't need to be shared. He thinks about how often he's judged himself for choosing a path that feels small to others. A job people don't ask many questions about. A life that doesn't come with impressive stories or visible milestones. For a long time, that bothered him. He felt like he was missing something important, like he should be striving harder, climbing faster, reaching for something more obvious. But lately, that pressure has started to loosen just a little, like a knot slowly giving way. Up here, there's no applause, no recognition, no one watching to decide whether he matters. And yet, there is steadiness. He taps the railing lightly with his fingers, feeling the vibration travel through the metal and into his hands. The building beneath him feels solid, grounded, doing exactly what it was built to do. He wonders when he stopped trusting himself to be the same. Maybe value doesn't always announce itself. Maybe it doesn't need an audience or a finish line. Maybe it can exist quietly like this moment, high enough to see clearly, alone enough to hear what usually gets drowned out. He stays there, breathing in the cool air, letting the city remain below him instead of inside his head, unaware that without trying to reach anything higher, he's already touching something rare. A kind of peace that doesn't come from arrival, but from allowing himself to stand exactly where he is. He doesn't check the time. Up here, minutes lose their sharp edges. There is no screen reminding him to move faster, no voice counting down what he should be doing next. The night stretches gently, and for once, he lets it. He steps back from the railing and walks a slow circle along the rooftop boots, making soft, familiar sounds against the concrete. Each step feels deliberate, not because he's trying to be mindful, but because the space naturally asks for it. There are places in life where noise fades without effort. This is one of them. He stops near the door and looks out again, this time noticing how the lights below don't compete with one another. They simply exist, scattered uneven, some bright, some dim, all of them enough in their own way. For years he thought being seen was the same thing as being valued. If no one noticed his effort, he assumed it didn't count. If no one asked about his nights, he felt like they didn't matter. That belief followed him quietly, shaping how he measured himself when no one else was around. But standing here alone with the wind and the low clouds, that belief begins to feel less solid. What if value isn't something that needs to be confirmed? What if worth doesn't disappear just because it isn't witnessed? He leans back against the wall and lets his head rest there for a moment. Eyes half closed, listening to the distant sounds of the city rise and fall like a breath. In this position, he feels supported not by attention or praise, but by something simpler: presence. He remembers times when being alone felt like failure, like evidence that he had missed a step everyone else seemed to know. He remembers the subtle shame of quiet weekends, unanswered messages, empty spaces on his calendar. Those memories still exist, but they don't carry the same weight now. Up here, solitude doesn't ask him to explain himself. It doesn't judge his pace or compare his path to anyone else's. It allows him to exist without needing to become something more impressive. The clouds shift again, slowly breaking apart, revealing small patches of clear sky. He watches them without expectation, without trying to read meaning into their movement. Things change on their own, he thinks. Not because we force them to, but because that's what they do. He adjusts his jacket and notices how his body feels less tense than it did earlier in the night. His shoulders have dropped. His jaw isn't clenched. The constant low-level effort of holding himself together has eased, even if just a little. He realizes how rarely he gives himself permission to rest in who he already is. So much of life has been about becoming better, becoming stronger, becoming someone worth choosing. But here on this quiet summit, there is no one to become. There is only standing. And in that standing, he feels something anchor into place. Not pride, not accomplishment, just a steady sense of being enough without needing to rise any higher. He opens his eyes fully and takes one last look at the city below. It hasn't changed. The lights still flicker. The streets still move. Life continues without noticing his pause. And somehow, that's comforting. He turns toward the door, ready to return to the quiet corridors and the rest of his shift, carrying nothing extra with him. No conclusions. No promises to reinvent his life. Just the understanding that being alone doesn't mean being lacking. Sometimes it simply means you've reached a place high enough and quiet enough to remember that your worth doesn't depend on how many people are standing beside you. And that too is a kind of summit. By the time the kitchen quiets down, their hands are still moving. Not fast anymore, just out of habit, guided by muscle memory that doesn't immediately understand that the rush is over. The last pan has been scrubbed, the counters wiped, the burners turned off one by one. But their body hasn't fully caught up yet. They stand at the stainless steel table under the dim backlight, looking at what's left. A plate sits in front of them, heavier than it should be, crowded with food that was never meant for one person. Portions added without thinking, extra scoops, a little more here, a little more there. Not because anyone asked, but because that's what they always do. Give more than necessary. Fill every gap. Make sure no one leaves wanting. They pick up a spoon and hesitate. All day their job is to keep things moving, to make sure everyone gets fed, satisfied, taken care of. There is comfort in that rhythm, in being useful in such a clear, measurable way. Plates come back empty. People don't complain. The system works. But at the end of the night, when the noise drains out of the room and only the low hum of the fridge remains, something else becomes visible. The overflow. They scrape the extra food gently into a container, the sound soft but distinct metal against ceramic. The plate underneath slowly reappears, its edges finally visible, clean and plain. It feels strange to stop before it's completely full again. For a long time they believed generosity meant filling every available space. If there was room, they filled it. If there was silence, they spoke. If someone seemed unsure, they stepped in. Saying no felt like waste, like selfishness, like letting something good go unused. But lately, exhaustion has been creeping in, quiet but persistent, settling into their shoulders and lower back, following them home even after the shift ends. No amount of sleep seems to fully touch it. They cap the container and set it aside, noticing how light the plate feels now. There's still food on it. Enough. Just not excessive. They sit down on a stool nearby and look at it for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for a feeling of guilt to arrive. It doesn't. Not exactly. Instead, there's a mild discomfort, the kind that comes when you do something unfamiliar, even if it's kinder. Their mind reaches automatically for old rules. You should give more. Someone else might need it. You can handle it. Those thoughts don't shout. They whisper. They remember learning those rules slowly over years. praised for being accommodating, thanked for being dependable, noticed most when they went a little past their limit. No one ever said, "You must empty yourself to be worthy." But the lesson still landed. They take a bite from the plate, tasting the food properly for the first time tonight. It's warm, simple grounding. Eating slowly feels almost rebellious, like stepping out of line when no one is watching. As they chew, they realize how often they treat themselves like an afterthought. Leftovers, rushed moments, whatever time remains after everyone else is satisfied. They glance at the container again. The overflow hasn't disappeared. It's just been set aside. And something about that feels important. Maybe giving doesn't always mean pouring everything out. Maybe it means knowing when the cup is already full. They finish the bite and rest their hands in their lap, noticing how their shoulders drop a fraction, how their breathing settles without effort. The kitchen feels different now, less like a place of output and more like a place that's allowed to be quiet. They don't come to any conclusions. They don't promise to change everything tomorrow. They simply sit with the plate in front of them, learning the shape of enough, realizing for the first time how long it's been since they allowed themselves to stop before crossing the line into depletion. And in that pause, something begins to soften, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to suggest that maybe what they've been calling generosity has been asking for a small correction. Not less care, just better balance. They don't rush to clean up. Normally, the moment they finish eating, their body would already be halfway back into motion, stacking dishes, wiping surfaces, preparing for whatever comes next. Tonight, they let the plate sit where it is unfinished, but no longer overwhelming. The kitchen feels different when there is no urgency. The low hum of the refrigerator fills the space, steady and patient, as if reminding them that things can continue without constant effort. They lean back slightly on the stool and let their feet rest flat on the floor, grounding themselves in the simple fact of being here. They think about how often they've equated self-worth with output. If they give more, they matter more. If they carry the extra load, they belong. If they never complain, they're appreciated. These beliefs weren't forced on them. They grew quietly, shaped by small moments of approval and relief, by the subtle comfort of being needed. Over time, giving stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like an obligation. But obligation, they are beginning to notice, has a different texture than care. Care feels warm, intentional, alive. Obligation feels tight, mechanical, draining. They look at the plate again, at the clear boundary where the food ends and the ceramic begins. That boundary feels symbolic in a way they wouldn't have expected. It's not a rejection. It's a definition. Enough has edges. For so long, they believed that boundaries made things smaller, that limits reduced what was possible. But sitting here now, they sense the opposite. The boundary is what allows the meal to be enjoyed, the body to relax, the moment to be fully lived. They remember times when they gave from emptiness, when generosity felt more like sacrifice than kindness. Those moments came with resentment. They didn't want to admit fatigue. They pushed through, and a quiet hope that someone would notice how much they were carrying. Tonight there is no audience, and in that absence, a different kind of honesty becomes possible. They place their hand over their stomach and notice the subtle signals their body has been sending all along. Full doesn't mean uncomfortable. Rested doesn't mean lazy. Stopping doesn't mean failing. These truths feel simple, almost obvious, and yet they have been ignored for years. They gather the plate and stand moving with an ease that wasn't there earlier. The container of extra food remains on the counter closed, waiting. Not wasted, just not consumed right now. Giving from overflow, they realize, doesn't require depletion. It requires patience. They rinse the plate and set it on the rack, the sound of water gentle, unhurried. Each movement feels less like a task and more like a continuation of the care they've been offering all day, only now it includes themselves. Before turning off the light, they pause and look around the kitchen one last time. Nothing has changed on the surface. The room is the same. The work will begin again tomorrow. But something internal has shifted. They no longer feel the need to prove their value by how much they can hold or how much they can give away. The sense of worth they're touching now feels steadier, quieter, and far less fragile. It doesn't ask them to empty themselves. It simply asks them to notice when the cup is full, and to trust that keeping what they need is not a betrayal of generosity, but the very thing that makes it sustainable. They turn off the light and step out of the kitchen, carrying that understanding with them, not as a rule, not as a promise, but as a gentle recalibration. From now on, they don't need to give everything. They only need to give what truly comes from abundance. The library sounds different after closing. Not silent exactly, but softened, as if every noise has learned to lower its voice out of respect. The air system hums gently overhead, steady and even, and somewhere in the distance, a cartwheel clicks once, then settles. She sits at one of the long wooden tables near the back, the kind meant for quiet reading, not conversation. A small desk lamp casts a warm circle of light over the open book in front of her, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. She turns a page slowly. The paper makes a soft, dry sound, barely noticeable, but it feels grounding. All day people move through the library carrying questions, needs, and stories that don't belong to her, but somehow linger anyway. She helps them find what they're looking for, smiles politely, listens carefully. By the time the doors lock for the night, she feels full in a way that isn't nourishing. She presses her thumb gently against the edge of the page and pauses. Not because the sentence is difficult, but because something in her chest has tightened again. It happens often quietly, without warning. Being open has always been part of who she is. People sense it quickly. They lean in, share more than they planned, trust her with pieces of themselves they haven't organized yet. She doesn't push them away. She knows how much courage that kind of sharing takes. But lately, she's begun to notice how porous she feels, as if there are no walls between her inner world and everyone else's. The lamp flickers faintly, then steadies. She exhales and lets her shoulders drop just a little. The room doesn't react. Nothing collapses when she stops holding herself so carefully. She looks up from the book and lets her eyes travel across the shelves, row after row of spines, each one holding a story that knows where it begins and where it ends. Boundaries, she thinks. Stories are allowed to have them. Somewhere along the way, she learned that kindness meant accessibility. Always available, always understanding, always willing to absorb what others couldn't carry alone. No one ever told her she had to do this. But the pattern formed anyway, reinforced by gratitude and relief, by the quiet praise that comes when you don't say no. She closes the book gently and rests her hands on the cover. The title doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling of containment, of something held safely between two firm edges. She wonders when she stopped believing she deserved the same. The idea of a sanctuary comes to her suddenly, not a physical place, but an inner one. A space untouched by expectation, where no explanations are required and no stories need to be processed or understood. A place where nothing can be taken. The thought feels both comforting and unfamiliar. She has always been good at creating safe spaces for others. Reading corners, quiet tables, gentle rules that protect silence without announcing themselves. But for herself, she has relied on endurance. She pushes her chair back slightly and stands, stretching her arms overhead in a slow, careful motion. The movement releases a subtle ache she didn't realize she was carrying. Her body responds immediately, grateful for the attention. As she lowers her arms, she imagines drawing a line not around her body, but within it. A boundary that doesn't harden her, doesn't make her distant, just defines where she ends and others begin. The idea doesn't feel selfish. It feels sane. She walks between the shelves, fingertips brushing lightly along the spines as she passes. Each book stays where it belongs. None of them spill into the next. None of them apologize for taking up space. She stops near the window and looks out at the dark street beyond the glass. The world continues on its own rhythm, indifferent to whether she is open or closed, giving or resting. For the first time all day, she feels a quiet permission settle in. Not to withdraw from life, not to become unreachable, but to protect something small and essential inside herself. A place no one else enters. Not because it's hidden, but because it's sacred. She turns away from the window and walks back toward the table. Her steps slow, unhurried, as if the library itself has adjusted to match her pace. The chair makes a soft sound as she pulls it out again, familiar and grounding. And she sits without opening the book this time. Instead, she rests her hands on the table and notices their warmth. For so long, she believed that being kind meant being open in every direction, like a room with no doors, no walls, no way to close anything off. She thought strength was the ability to stay exposed without flinching, to remain available, no matter how much passed through her. But exposure, she is learning, is not the same as openness. Openness has choice. Exposure does not. The distinction feels subtle but important, like the difference between offering a seat and giving away the whole room. She leans back slightly and lets her gaze soften, no longer focused on any one thing. The quiet wraps around her, not as emptiness, but as presence. The library has always been a place where voices lower themselves naturally, where urgency dissolves into something more patient. She wonders why she hasn't allowed herself to internalize that same rule. Inside her, there has always been a space she never named, a place she rarely visited, because she didn't think she was allowed to linger there. It's the part of her that doesn't explain, doesn't justify, doesn't make sense of pain for anyone else's comfort. A place that doesn't answer questions. Tonight, she lets herself imagine stepping into it. There are no shelves there, no words waiting to be arranged. Just a stillness that doesn't feel empty, but intact. Nothing is broken. Nothing needs to be fixed. She feels her breath slow without effort. Protecting this space, she realizes, doesn't mean closing her heart. It means refusing to let every feeling become public property. It means understanding that some things are meant to be held, not shared, not processed aloud, not softened for others. She has spent years translating herself into something digestible. Tonight she stops. The decision doesn't arrive as a declaration. It's quieter than that. More like a gentle internal shift, a subtle repositioning of weight. She doesn't vow to change how she shows up in the world tomorrow. She doesn't rehearse boundaries or imagine difficult conversations. She simply recognizes that there is a part of her that does not need permission to exist. That part is already whole. She stands and turns off the desk lamp, letting the room settle into deeper shadow. The darkness doesn't feel threatening. It feels protective, like a cover drawn gently over something precious. As she walks toward the exit, she notices how her body feels lighter. Not because anything has been resolved, but because something has been released. The constant vigilance, the quiet readiness to receive whatever comes next, has loosened its grip. At the door, she pauses and looks back once more at the long rows of shelves disappearing into the dim light. Each book remains exactly where it belongs, closed when it needs to be open when invited. She smiles softly at the thought. She doesn't need to be endlessly accessible to be kind. She doesn't need to be unguarded to be loving. She doesn't need to give everyone access to her deepest places in order to be real. Somewhere inside her, there is a sanctuary that remains untouched, not because she is hiding, but because she is honoring it. She locks the door and steps out into the night, carrying that understanding with her. Not as armor, not as distance, but as quiet reverence, a knowing that no matter what the world brings to her tomorrow, there is a place within that remains safe, steady, and entirely her own. A place no one enters. And for the first time in a long while, she trusts herself to keep it that way. In the greenhouse, the morning has its own kind of quiet. It isn't the quiet of a room with nothing in it. It's the quiet of living things that don't speak but are still doing their work. The air is warm and damp, and the plastic panels above hold soft beads of condensation that catch the early light like small, steady stars. He walks down the narrow aisle with a hose in one hand, careful not to drag it too hard across the floor. The water inside moves with a gentle weight, and when he turns the nozzle, a fine spray comes out with a soft hiss, like a calm exhale. He waters the seedlings one tray at a time. The tiny plants don't look like much yet. Just thin stems, small leaves, the kind of green that seems almost too fragile to last. If someone who didn't know anything walked in, they might shrug and assume nothing important is happening. But he knows better. He has spent enough mornings in this place to understand how life builds itself quietly, not in sudden jumps, not in dramatic transformations, but in tiny, almost invisible shifts that only add up if you keep showing up. He moves slowly, watching the soil darken as it drinks. The smell is earthy and clean, like the inside of a garden after rain. The sound of water landing is soft but constant, a rhythm he has come to rely on more than he expected. Sometimes he thinks he likes the plants because they don't rush him. They don't ask him who he is. They don't ask what he's planning. They don't ask why he hasn't figured everything out yet. They simply grow at their own pace, and if he is patient and consistent, they respond. Outside the greenhouse, people talk about big dreams, big goals, big changes, big results. He has heard it plenty of times. In passing conversations, in loud advice, in the way the world seems to favor anything that looks impressive on the surface, the message is always the same. If you want something, you need to push harder, move faster, prove you deserve it. He used to believe that. He used to believe that if he wasn't becoming something huge, then he was wasting his time. If he couldn't point to a major achievement, then his life was too small to matter. That belief sat in him like a weight for years. Even now, it hasn't disappeared completely. It still shows up on certain mornings when he looks at the trays of seedlings and feels a strange impatience rise in his chest, like a voice saying, "This is it. This is all you've got." He knows that voice. It's the same voice that makes him compare his life to other people's highlight reels. The same voice that turns other people's success into evidence of his failure. The same voice that calls slow progress stuck. He tightens his grip on the hose for a moment, then loosens it again, reminding himself to keep the spray gentle. Too much water at once doesn't help. It floods. It harms. The seedlings don't respond well to force. He thinks about how true that is for people too, even though it's something he forgets often. You can't pressure yourself into blooming. You can't punish yourself into becoming whole. The plants are teaching him that slowly, without words. He finishes one row and steps back, letting the water settle into the soil. The droplets on the leaves hold their shape for a second before sliding down, disappearing into the base where they're needed. He looks at the smallest seedling in the tray, the one that always seems behind the others. It stands there quiet, not apologizing for being small. And for a moment, he imagines what it might be dreaming if a seedling could dream. Not a small dream, a full dream. A dream of being a tree that spreads wide, with roots deep enough to hold steady through storms, with branches that reach out without fear, with shade that comforts anyone who stands beneath it. The thought makes something in him soften, because he knows that feeling. He has carried a dream like that too. Not necessarily to be famous or admired, but to be solid. To be someone who doesn't break easily. To feel like he belongs in his own life. To wake up without that constant sense of falling behind. Sometimes he wonders if that dream is too big for him. Sometimes he thinks he should shrink it to match what his life looks like right now. But then he looks at the seedling again, thin and quiet, and he remembers something simple. A seed doesn't have to look like a tree in order to be one. It just has to keep going. He turns the nozzle slightly and gives the tray one more gentle pass, making sure the corners aren't dry. The water lands like a soft promise, not hurried, not dramatic, just consistent. And as he moves down the aisle toward the next row, he feels the pressure in his chest ease a little, replaced by something steadier. Not certainty, not confidence that everything will work out. Just a calm understanding that growth is not always visible from day to day, and that being small right now is not a sign that he is failing. It might simply be the beginning. He coils the hose neatly against the wall and wipes his hands on the side of his pants, leaving faint dark marks that fade as the fabric dries. The work isn't finished, but this part of it is, and that feels enough for now. The greenhouse holds its warmth as he moves through it, the air wrapping around him in a way that feels protective rather than heavy. The seedlings stand quietly in their trays, unchanged to the eye, yet already different from how they were a few minutes ago. Growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be witnessed. It happens whether anyone is paying attention or not. He pauses at the end of the aisle and looks back at the rows of green, all at different stages. None of them ahead or behind in any meaningful way. They are simply responding to the conditions they've been given, doing the only work they know how to do. He thinks about how often he's tried to rush his own becoming, how he's compared his middle to someone else's outcome, how he's measured his worth against timelines that were never his, how he's mistaken impatience for motivation. Those habits didn't come from nowhere. They came from fear. From the belief that if he didn't grow fast enough, he would be left behind, overlooked, forgotten. But the plants don't grow out of fear. They grow out of alignment. They grow because the soil is right, the water is steady, and the light arrives when it can. They don't question whether they deserve the sun. They don't hold back because another plant nearby seems taller. They just receive what's offered and respond honestly. He steps closer to the smallest seedling again, the one he noticed earlier. It hasn't changed, not in any visible way, but something about it feels more present now. It stands without urgency, without comparison, without apology. It doesn't dream of being anything other than what it already is on its way to becoming. That realization lands gently in him. Maybe the problem was never that his dream was too big. Maybe the problem was that he kept trying to live it too early. A seed doesn't strain to act like a tree. It doesn't harden its stem in advance. It doesn't borrow strength it hasn't grown yet. It trusts the process it's inside of. He places his hand lightly on the edge of the tray, not touching the plant, just feeling the solid frame beneath it. The structure exists to support growth, not to rush it. For the first time in a long while, he considers the idea that he might not need to add anything to himself. No new identity, no dramatic reinvention, no proof that he's doing life right. He might only need to stop stripping himself of patience. Stop crowding his days with comparison. Stop calling slowness a flaw. Stop confusing visibility with value. The greenhouse door opens slightly as a breeze shifts outside, and fresh air slips in cool against the warmth. The balance feels good. Not too much, not too little. He breathes it in and feels something settle. He doesn't suddenly believe that everything will work out. He doesn't imagine a future where doubt never returns. but he does feel a quiet permission to stay where he is without judging it, to grow at the speed that feels true. As he turns to leave, the seedlings remain behind, unchanged in appearance, yet undeniably alive, continuing their work without needing his attention. He knows that when he returns tomorrow, they will have moved forward in ways too small to measure, yet real all the same. And maybe he will too. Because the dream he's been carrying was never about becoming impressive overnight. It was about becoming rooted. Strong enough to stand, flexible enough to bend, patient enough to let time do what it does best. He switches off the greenhouse light and steps into the morning carrying nothing extra with him. Just the understanding that even the smallest seed holds the memory of a forest, and that healing-like growth begins the moment you stop asking yourself to be something you are not yet ready to be. The shop is quiet in a way it never is during the day. The buzzing machines are off, the chairs are empty, and the air smells faintly of ink and disinfectant. The only light comes from a small lamp over the counter, casting long shadows across bottles lined up in careful rows. They stand in front of the mixing station, sleeves rolled up, studying the colors laid out in front of them. Black, white, a few base tones that look simple on their own. During the day, people come in knowing exactly what they want or thinking they do. They bring photos, ideas, references pulled from somewhere else. Their voices are confident when they talk about their skin, their stories, their permanence. At night, after the doors are locked, the shop belongs to process. They open one bottle and squeeze a small amount into a clean cup. The ink makes a soft sound as it lands thick and slow. Another color follows, then another, each added carefully, deliberately. This part of the work doesn't allow rushing. They've learned that the hard way. Early on, they believed that skill meant precision alone. Follow the formula. Copy what works. Don't deviate. But ink has a way of teaching humility. What looks right on paper can look wrong on skin. What works for one person can fail completely on another. And what feels safe can be lifeless. They stir the mixture slowly, watching the colors fold into one another, changing with every small movement. The shade deepens, then softens, then shifts again, refusing to settle too quickly. Life, they think, does something similar. It hands you pieces without explanation. A childhood that left marks, a talent you didn't ask for, a job you fell into instead of choosing. For a long time, they tried to follow other people's palettes, hoping that if they copied the right combination, their life would finally look the way it was supposed to. But something always felt off, like the colors never quite belonged together. They tapped the stirring stick lightly against the cup, letting the excess drip back in. The sound is small but satisfying, controlled. They hold the cup up to the light and squint, evaluating. Not ready yet. They add a drop of white, then pause, considering. Too much light can wash things out. Too little can make everything feel heavy. Balance matters, but balance isn't a fixed point. It's a relationship. They stir again, slower this time. They think about how often they've been told to be yourself, as if that were a single stable thing, as if identity came pre-mixed, waiting to be poured. But nothing they've lived supports that idea. They have changed with every place they've been, every relationship, every mistake. The colors of their life have shifted, whether they wanted them to or not. What they're learning now is that they still get a say. They don't control what colors show up, but they do control how they're combined. The thought settles into them quietly, not as a declaration, but as a possibility. They wipe their hands on a clean towel and look around the shop. Flash art on the walls, chairs pushed in, tools resting where they belong. Everything is ready even though nothing is happening. This is the part no one sees. The careful attention, the trial and error, the patience to let things become what they are. They hold the cup again and notice how the color has changed, deepened, gained complexity. It's not what they started with, and it's not what they expected, but it feels right. Still, they hesitate. Old habits rise up. What if it's wrong? What if someone else would do it better? What if you ruin it? Those thoughts have stopped them before, kept them stuck in safe, dull combinations that never felt like theirs. They take a breath and keep stirring. The color responds, shifting once more, as if meeting them halfway. And in that small, ordinary moment, something clicks. Maybe their life doesn't need to match anyone else's picture. Maybe it just needs to be honest. They set the cup down on the counter and step back, giving the color a moment to settle. Ink, like people, needs time to reveal what it truly is. What looks finished too soon often changes once it rests. The shop hums softly around them, not with noise, but with readiness. Everything here has a purpose, even in stillness. They lean their weight against the counter and let their arms relax, noticing how their body feels less tense than it did earlier. For a long time, they believed their life should come together cleanly. A clear plan, a recognizable path, a version of themselves that made sense from the outside. When that didn't happen, they assumed something was wrong with them. They tried to correct it by choosing safer options, quieter colors combinations that didn't draw too much attention. But safety, they are learning, can slowly drain meaning from things. They pick up the cup again and tilt it slightly, watching the ink move along the edge. It's richer now, more layered, holding depth that wasn't there before. The color couldn't have existed without every part that went into it, even the ones they once wished away. They think about the parts of themselves they tried to edit out. The sensitivity that felt inconvenient. The curiosity that didn't fit a clear role. The moments of doubt they treated as weaknesses. What if those weren't flaws? What if they were pigments? They add one final careful drop and stir just enough to incorporate it, then stop. Overworking the mixture would only flatten it. Knowing when to stop matters as much as knowing when to begin. That lesson feels personal. So much of their exhaustion has come from overcorrecting, from trying to fix things that were never broken, from chasing an imagined right way to live. They thought healing meant erasing inconsistencies. But maybe healing is learning how to let them coexist. They pour a small amount of ink into a test cap and hold it under the light. The color holds. It doesn't fight itself. It looks intentional, even though it was shaped by trial and error. They feel a quiet satisfaction settle in, not the rush of approval, but the steadier feeling of alignment. This color won't be for everyone. and that's okay. Not every shade is meant to be universal. Some are meant to belong to specific skins, specific stories, specific moments. Trying to please everyone only muddies the result. They clean the mixing tools slowly, rinsing them under warm water, watching the ink swirl away and disappear. There's something freeing about letting go of what's no longer needed. They don't need to cling to old versions of themselves. They don't need to defend past choices. They don't need to justify how they got here. What matters is how they move forward with what remains. They label the cup and place it carefully on the shelf, not rushing to use it right away. Some things are allowed to wait until the moment feels right. As they turn off the lamp and prepare to leave, the shop falls into shadow again, calm and patient. Nothing is unfinished. Nothing is wrong. They step outside into the quiet night, carrying with them a simple understanding. Life will keep handing them colors they didn't choose, but they are still the one holding the brush. And with a little patience, a little honesty, and the courage to stop forcing harmony too soon, they can create something that doesn't need to be perfect to be true. Something that finally looks like them. The break room is quieter than the rest of the floor, but it's never truly still. Even with the door closed, the sounds find their way in. A monitor beeps somewhere down the hall. Shoes move quickly across polished floors. A cart rattles, then fades. Life keeps happening just outside the thin walls. She pours hot water into a paper cup and watches the tea bag darken slowly, the color spreading outward in soft waves. Steam rises warm against her face, and for a moment that warmth is the only thing she pays attention to. Her shift isn't over yet, but this pause belongs to her. She sits down and wraps both hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. It surprises her how cold they feel. All day she's been moving without noticing her body at all, responding, adjusting, holding steady, while everything else feels uncertain. That's what she's good at. Remaining calm when others can't. Staying present when things turn urgent. Keeping her voice even when fear fills the room. People say she has a strong presence, that she's grounded, that she brings reassurance just by standing there. She nods when they say it. But what they don't see is how loud her mind can be once she steps away. The second she sits down, the day rushes back in. Images, decisions, words she wonders if she chose correctly, faces she hopes she'll forget before they follow her home. She takes a slow sip of the tea and feels it travel down, warm and steady. She doesn't rush the next breath. She lets it arrive on its own. Inhale, exhale. She doesn't try to calm herself. She's learned that forcing calm usually does the opposite. Instead, she notices the weight of her shoulders, the tension behind her eyes, the subtle ache in her lower back. These sensations don't scare her. They feel familiar, like old companions she doesn't need to entertain, but doesn't need to fight either. Over the years, she's learned how to separate herself just enough to keep going. Not dissociating, not shutting down, just observing. It started as a survival skill. When things got intense, she would step slightly back inside herself, creating a small pocket of space where she could breathe and think clearly. At first it felt like distance. Now it feels more like clarity. She watches her thoughts move the same way she watches the steam rise from the cup. They appear shift shape and disappear without asking for permission. Some of them carry weight. Others pass quickly. She doesn't chase any of them. For a moment, she notices something surprising. There is a part of her that is not overwhelmed. Even now, even here. It's quiet, still, unmoved by the urgency around it. This part isn't trying to fix anything. It isn't offering comfort or solutions. It's simply watching steady and intact like the center of a spinning wheel. She's felt it before in brief flashes, in the early morning before the day begins, late at night when the world finally softens, in moments when everything slows without warning. She never paid much attention to it. There was always too much to do. But sitting here now, she realizes that this observing presence has never left her. It's been here through every difficult shift, every hard conversation, every moment she thought she might not be able to keep going. It hasn't been loud. It hasn't demanded recognition. It has simply been. She sets the cup down and rests her hands on the table, palms flat, grounding herself in the solid surface. The room feels slightly larger now, not because anything has changed, but because she's no longer packed so tightly inside her thoughts. Outside, a voice calls out. Another beep follows. Her break will end soon, but before she stands, she stays with that quiet center. A moment longer, curious about it, respectful of it, beginning to understand that no matter how chaotic things become, there is a place within her that remains untouched, a place that watches and waits. She checks the time on the wall clock, not because she's rushing, but because the habit is familiar. There are still a few minutes left, and she lets them stretch instead of filling them with thought. The observing presence stays. It doesn't comment on how she's doing. It doesn't rank the day as good or bad. It doesn't demand improvement. It simply notices. She realizes how rare that is. Most of her life has been lived under evaluation, either from others or from herself. Even rest has often come with conditions. Rest so you can work better later. Pause so you don't fall behind. Nothing is ever just allowed to be. But this quiet watcher inside her isn't interested in outcomes. It watches her breath rise and fall. It watches the tension soften in her hands. It watches the thoughts slow down on their own. She doesn't feel separate from the chaos of the world. She still hears the monitors, the footsteps, the voices beyond the door. But the chaos no longer defines her entire experience. It's happening around her, not inside her. That distinction feels important. For years, she believed that being strong meant absorbing everything. Without breaking that resilience meant holding it all inside and carrying it home quietly. But maybe real strength is knowing where to place things. Not every sound belongs in her chest. Not every emotion needs to be carried forward. Not every moment needs to leave a mark. The watcher understands that. It doesn't push feelings away. It lets them pass through the way weather passes across the sky without damaging the sky itself. Storms come, storms go. The space remains. She takes one last sip of tea and notices that it is cooled. Even warmth is temporary, she thinks, and that feels oddly reassuring. Nothing needs to be held forever. She stands slowly, stretching her legs, feeling the floor beneath her shoes. The observer moves with her, unchanged by the shift, steady and calm. As she opens the break room door, the noise grows louder, sharper. The day rushes back in demanding attention. But something inside her stays anchored. She doesn't need to retreat inward or harden herself. She doesn't need to shut anything down. She simply carries the awareness with her. Throughout the rest of her shift, moments come and go. Urgency rises, decisions are made, voices overlap. And beneath it all, the watcher remains. Not distant, not cold, just present. She begins to understand that healing doesn't always mean feeling better. Sometimes it means knowing that no matter what she feels, there is a part of her that is not shaken by it. A part that does not get swept away. When her shift finally ends and she steps outside into the night air, she pauses for just a second, letting the coolness touch her face. She notices the contrast. The quiet after noise. The stillness after motion. The watcher notices too. She smiles faintly, not because everything is resolved, but because something important has been remembered. No matter how intense the world becomes, there is always a place within her that remains calm, clear, and whole. A place that watches. And in that watching, she finds a gentle kind of peace that doesn't depend on the absence of storms, only on the knowledge that she is more than whatever passes through her. The engine clicks softly as it cools one small sound at a time, like the car is slowly letting go of the work it's done tonight. He sits in the driver's seat a moment longer than necessary. Hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes on the dark windshield where the city lights blur into loose shapes. The ride is over. The app is closed. For now, nothing is asking him to move. The parking lot is almost empty. A few cars sit far apart, their metal catching bits of orange light from the street lamps. Somewhere in the distance, a door closes. Then quiet settles back in. He exhales and leans his head against the seat. All day, numbers have been floating through his mind. Ratings, percentages, tips calculated and recalculated in quick glances. 5 stars feels good. 4 stars feels confusing. Anything lower lands heavy, even when he knows it shouldn't. He tells himself not to take it personally. He tells himself people are unpredictable. He tells himself tomorrow will be different. Still, the numbers stick. He reaches up and pulls the seatbelt free, letting it slide back with a familiar snap. The sound echoes slightly in the empty space, sharper than he expects. He rubs his hands together once, slow and deliberate, as if warming them, even though the car is still comfortable. It's strange how something so small can shake you. A comment left without context. A silence where gratitude might have been. A low rating with no explanation. None of it says anything concrete about who he is. And yet his body reacts as if it does. For a long time, he believed his value lived just outside of him, in approval, in positive feedback, in being chosen again and again. Driving made that belief visible. Every ride felt like a test, every passenger a quiet judge. He found himself adjusting constantly music choices, conversation levels, even the way he laughed, trying to stay ahead of disappointment. At first it felt like flexibility. Later it started to feel like erosion. He glances at his phone again, though he already knows what it will show. The number hasn't changed. It sits there neutral and final, as if daring him to argue with it. He doesn't. Instead, he sets the phone face down on the passenger seat. The motion surprises him. Normally, he would stare at it longer, replay the ride in his head, searching for the moment he might have failed without realizing it. But tonight, something in him is tired of chasing answers that never arrive. He shifts in his seat and notices the pressure of his back against the cushion, the steady support he hasn't paid attention to all evening. The car holds him without asking him to earn it. That thought lingers. Outside the windshield, a breeze moves through a line of trees at the edge of the lot. Their branches swaying gently steady despite the traffic that rushes past on the road beyond. They don't move because they're unsure. They move because they're anchored. He's always liked the idea of an anchor. Something heavy enough to hold. Something quiet enough not to announce itself. Something that keeps you from drifting when the current shifts. But he spent years using other people's reactions as that anchor, letting their approval decide how solid he felt on any given day. When the feedback was good, he felt steady. When it wasn't, everything wobbled. That kind of anchoring he's starting to see is fragile. He closes his eyes briefly and lets the quiet press in. Without the app running, without voices in the back seat, without directions being called out, he's just here. A person in a parked car breathing. There's discomfort in that simplicity. Without reflection from others, he isn't sure how to measure himself. But there's also relief. Because maybe he doesn't need to measure anything right now. He opens his eyes and looks around the car. The scuffed dashboard, the cup holder with a faint ring at the bottom, the small imperfections that prove this space has been lived in. None of it is perfect. None of it is trying to be. And somehow it still works. He thinks about how much energy he spent trying to be smooth, pleasant, agreeable. Trying to anticipate needs before they're spoken. Trying to earn ease instead of allowing it. The engine is quiet now, fully cooled. He rests his hands in his lap and notices how his shoulders drop a fraction, like something heavy has been set down, even if just for a moment. Maybe worth isn't something that floats. Maybe it's something you drop into yourself. Something solid. Something internal, something that doesn't shift every time the surface changes. He doesn't know how to do that yet. But sitting here in the quiet with a phone face down and the car no longer moving, he senses the beginning of it. A weight settling, an anchor touching bottom. He opens the car door and steps out slowly, letting the night air meet his face. It's cooler than inside, and the contrast pulls him fully into his body. His shoes touch the pavement with a solid, familiar sound. The ground feels steady beneath him. He hadn't realized how much he'd been living in anticipation, waiting for the next notification, the next rating, the next small signal that would tell him how to feel about himself. Standing here now away from the screen, that habit feels exposed. Not wrong, just exhausting. He closes the door gently and hears the soft thud echo in the empty lot. The car doesn't move. It doesn't need reassurance. It simply stays where it is supported by its own weight. He thinks again about anchors. They don't stop the water from moving. They don't fight the current. They just hold their place. For years, he's tried to adjust himself to every shift in the tide, believing that adaptability was the same as stability. He became skilled at reading people quickly, sensing moods, adjusting his tone. That skill helped him survive, helped him succeed in small ways. But it also left him unmoored. Every comment had the power to pull him in a different direction. Every piece of feedback could shake his sense of who he was, even when it contradicted what he knew to be true. He leans against the side of the car and looks up at the sky, barely visible between streetlights. The stars, if they're there, don't need his attention. They exist without witnesses. That thought settles into him. Maybe his worth can exist the same way. He doesn't need to become indifferent or detached. He can still care about doing a good job. He can still listen, still improve, still learn. But caring doesn't have to mean surrendering his center. An anchor doesn't make a boat rigid. It makes movement possible without drifting away. He breathes in slowly and feels his chest rise, then fall. The rhythm is his own, not influenced by anything external. For a moment that feels unfamiliar. Then it feels relieving. He remembers times earlier in his life when he knew who he was without needing confirmation. Before numbers, before scores, before constant comparison. That sense of self wasn't louder back then. It was simpler. It didn't ask for applause. Standing in the quiet lot, he allows that memory to resurface without trying to force it into shape. He doesn't need to recreate it exactly. He just needs to remember that it's possible. He checks his phone one last time, not to judge himself, but to acknowledge it. Then he slips it into his pocket without reopening the app. The night doesn't react. Nothing changes. And that's the point. As he walks toward the building entrance, he notices how his steps feel heavier in a good way, grounded rather than dragged. The small aches of the day are still there, but they no longer define the moment. He understands now that value anchored in others will always shift. Value anchored within has weight. It doesn't rise and fall with opinion. It doesn't disappear with silence. It doesn't need to be defended. He unlocks the door and steps inside, leaving the parking lot behind. Tomorrow the rides will start again. The numbers will update. The world will offer its opinions freely. But tonight he carries something steadier with him. Not confidence, not certainty, just an anchor. And for the first time in a long while, he trusts that it will hold. The office feels different after everyone leaves. Not empty, just quieter, like a place that has finished listening for the day. The overhead lights are dimmed, and the air holds a faint mix of paper coffee and something antiseptic that never quite goes away. They stand by the filing cabinet, holding a thin folder in both hands. The folder isn't heavy, but they treat it carefully anyway. Inside are notes from sessions they didn't lead stories they were trusted to observe, but not yet carry alone. As an intern, their role is to listen, to learn to witness more than they speak. They slide the folder into the drawer and push it closed slowly, feeling the soft resistance before it clicks into place. The sound lingers. All day they've been sitting across from people who carry pain in different shapes. Some bring it neatly organized, labeled with diagnoses and timelines. Others bring it in fragments, scattered and raw, still forming into something that can be spoken. They listen to all of it. And even though they're trained not to take it home, some of it follows anyway. Not as images, but as weight. A quiet pressure behind the eyes. A heaviness in the chest that shows up later when the room is finally still. They pull out a chair and sit, letting their shoulders drop. This wasn't the path they imagined when they started. They thought healing work would feel more linear, more hopeful, more clearly rewarding. They imagined progress that moved forward in clean steps, measurable and reassuring. Instead, they found stories that loop, pain that returns in new forms, old wounds that reopen when least expected. At first, that scared them. They wondered if something was wrong with the process, or worse with them. If witnessing so much pain meant absorbing it, if empathy required suffering alongside others without relief. They glance around the room. The shelves along the wall are filled with books they've read and books they haven't touched yet. Thick volumes, slim paperbacks, some with worn spines, others crisp and new. A thought drifts in, unexpected. What if pain isn't just something to fix? What if it's something to understand? They've noticed how every person who sits in the chair across from them brings a story shaped by loss, disappointment, fear, or shame. No two stories are the same, even when the labels match. Depression doesn't look identical from one life to the next. Grief doesn't follow a single script. Each experience is its own text. They rest their hands on the desk and imagine each life as a book, not one to be skimmed or judged, but one to be read slowly, with care. Some chapters are harder to get through. Some pages feel unbearable. But all of it holds meaning that can't be reduced to a summary. That includes their own story. They realize how often they've tried to edit their past, to compress painful experiences into lessons that sound neat and useful. They wanted the pain to justify itself, to prove it led somewhere good. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the value of those experiences wasn't in how quickly they healed, but in what they taught them about depth, patience, and presence. They stand and walk over to the shelves, running their finger lightly along the spines. Some books have been checked out countless times. Others look untouched, waiting. Not every book is meant for everyone. Not every story needs to be shared all at once. That feels important. They think about the moments in their own life that shaped them. Most times, they would rather not revisit, yet somehow can't deny their influence. Those experiences didn't break them. They added pages, perspective, sensitivity, a capacity to sit with discomfort without turning away. These qualities don't show up on resumes. They don't announce themselves in conversation. But they shape how someone listens, how they respond, how they hold space for another human being. They return to the desk and sit again, feeling the chair support their weight. The room doesn't feel heavy now. It feels held. If pain is a library, they think then healing isn't about burning the books. It's about learning how to read them, slowly, honestly, without rushing to the ending. They turn off the desk lamp, leaving the room in soft shadow, and gather their things. The day isn't resolved. The stories aren't finished. Their training is still ongoing. But as they step toward the door, they carry a subtle shift with them, an understanding that nothing they've lived through is wasted. Every difficult experience is a volume added to a living library, one that continues to grow not as a record of suffering, but as a collection of wisdom that only comes from having lived fully, imperfectly, and with an open heart. They pause at the doorway and look back once more, as if the room might say something before they leave. It doesn't. It simply remains holding the quiet the way it always has, without expectation. They turn off the last light and let the hallway glow spill in. Walking down the corridor, their steps echo softly, and they notice how different the building feels now that the voices are gone. During the day, it absorbs so much emotion without protest. At night, it releases it slowly, like a long exhale. They think about the stories they heard today. None of them are complete. None of them end neatly. Most of them are still being written. For a long time, they believed healing meant closing chapters as quickly as possible, moving past pain so it couldn't hurt again. They believed strength was measured by how little someone talked about what happened to them. But sitting with story after story has changed that belief. Unprocessed pain doesn't disappear. It waits. It shows up later in subtle ways, in reactions that feel too big, in patterns that repeat in a quiet sense of disconnection from the present moment. Ignoring a book doesn't erase its contents. It just leaves it unread. They stop near the stairwell and rest their hand on the railing, feeling the cool metal under their palm. The sensation anchors them in the present, reminding them that they are here now, not back in the stories they witnessed, not lost in their own past. They've learned that reading a painful chapter doesn't mean reliving it. It means allowing it to exist without control. When a book is read with care, it doesn't overwhelm. It informs. It deepens understanding. It adds context. The same is true for experience. They think about their own life again, about the moments they once labeled as mistakes or weaknesses. Those moments didn't make them less capable. They shaped how they notice suffering in others, how they slow down instead of rushing to solutions, how they sit without trying to fix what isn't ready to be fixed. These are quiet skills. They don't sparkle. They don't perform well in a world that values speed and certainty. But they matter. Outside, the night air is cool and clean. They step out of the building and take a slow breath, letting the day settle behind them. The weight they carried earlier feels different now. Less like a burden, more like a responsibility they've learned how to hold. Healing, they realize, isn't about turning pain into something useful. It's about letting pain be acknowledged, integrated, and respected for what it has already taught. They don't need to explain their scars. They don't need to justify their journey. They don't need to rush toward a version of themselves that looks finished. A living library is never complete. New books arrive. Old ones are reread with fresh eyes. Meanings change as the reader grows. And that's not a failure of healing. That's life. They walk toward their car, feeling the ground beneath each step, carrying their own story, with a little more tenderness than before. Not as something to overcome, but as something to understand. Because every experience they've lived through, even the painful ones, has added to the depth of who they are. And in that depth, they find a quiet kind of worth not built on perfection or progress, but on the simple truth that nothing they have lived has been meaningless. Not a single page. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.